Why did Paul baptize? For the gospel's sake. For the gospel. But those who like to bring you up front to the baptistry because they, Galatians 6:12, desire to make a fair show of your flesh in front of others, they'll say, well, even Paul baptized in the book of Acts. We're well aware of Paul baptizing a few during the transitional book of Acts, and we're just as aware of Christ sending him not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, 1 Corinthians 1:17. Which that statement alone should tell us that Paul's gospel doesn't include water. And think about it. That statement, Christ sent me not to baptize. What other apostle would have dared to say that? The book of Acts is a historical document documenting the transition from one nation to all nations, from an earthly kingdom to a heavenly kingdom, Peter to Paul, physical circumcision to spiritual circumcision, and water baptism, chapter 2, verse 38, to spirit baptism, 1 Corinthians 12:13. By doing a simple math exercise, we can see that water baptism and spiritual baptism equals two baptisms, but Ephesians 4:4 says there's only one baptism. Without right division, you'll remain confused. There's a verse here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 I think can help us answer the question of why did Paul baptize. Verse 20. And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. This tells us what? That there's certain things Paul would do when he was among the Jews that he never instructed you or I to do today. And his specific reason for doing that was, as he said, that I might gain them. There were times when Paul was very careful to not offend his kinsmen in the flesh, and such was the case in Acts 16. In verse 3, go read it, and you'll notice there were Jews there in the quarters when Paul had Timothy circumcised. So think, Paul had Timothy circumcised, even though in Galatians chapter 5, verse 6, he tells us that circumcision availeth nothing. And in 1 Corinthians 8:13, he talks about how he would abstain from meat in order to not offend the Jews there in the assembly who had a weaker conscience. But in Galatians 2:12, he dined with Gentiles and wrote over there in 1 Timothy 4:4 that every creature is good and nothing to be refused. This is how Paul operated. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And this I do for the gospel's sake. That's 1 Corinthians 9:22. So why did Paul baptize a few? For the gospel's sake. Same reason he had Timothy circumcised. Paul was equipped with a different gospel than the 12 and was commissioned to go to both the Jews and the Gentiles. That's why he said, I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. In Acts 18, we see Paul left Ephesus by way of boat. He sailed to Jerusalem to observe the Feast of Pentecost. Yet in Galatians 4, he tells us that those who observe special days are depending on the weak and beggarly elements that puts them under bondage. And in Acts 18, he shaved his head, which signified that he had completed a Nazirite vow. And there was a time when Paul had the gift of healing. In Acts 19, people were being healed of their diseases by Paul's handkerchiefs. Yet later on, he couldn't heal Timothy, 1 Timothy 5:23. He couldn't heal Trophimus, 2 Timothy 4:20. And he couldn't even heal himself, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 to 10. In Acts 2:38, Peter preached water baptism was necessary to receive the remission of sins. 2 Corinthians 5:19 says God's not even charging sins to anyone, not one person under the grace administration. So a simple question should solve this. What non-charged sin do I need remission for? It can't be remitted if it isn't showing up in my account. Paul wrote 13 epistles, and we only have one singular passage on water baptism, and no one talks about it. What does it say? That Christ sent him not to do it. Oh, but religion has fooled the masses. So to say that because Paul baptized a few, we should be baptizing today, without further researching that matter for yourself, is a sure sign of a lazy Bible student.